You're listening to Renegade Broadcasting.
Oh, heal sleepless nights, be merciful. I have found myself lost amongst the shards of a world reduced to shadow, sentenced to a lifetime in this prison. Well, I should have taken this omen and ran, abandoned myself to secret corners.
Good evening, everyone. You're listening to Renegade Broadcasting. Today is March 19th, 2018. I'm your host, Richard Kadokevich, and this is Arcane Semantics. Well, tonight we're going to be discussing the ties and links between government and government agencies with Hollywood and many of the key players within, and just many of the purposeful depictions to craft the reality as you perceive it. We're once again going to have one of my very good co-hosts with me here tonight, and that would be one Mr. Rollie Quaid. Hello, Rollie. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great, Richard. I guess our show last week was so well that you called me back on. Thank you, Renegade audience, and thank you, Richard, for allowing me to be back on Arcade Semantics.
Requested back by popular demand, what can I say? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, there might be some confusion, but as to, if it's a regular, but actually I would like it to be a regular feature, to have a couple individuals regularly on, certainly yourself being one of them. It's great to have a co-host vibe, and you don't get that with a guest, most of the time with a regular guest, so, I like the added sort of dynamic we bring together. And, I love this topic too, but the CIA and Hollywood has just been definitely linked at the hip for quite some time. Most people will dismiss a lot of things if they can relate it to something in a film. Oh, that's not real. That's not really what's going on out there. You just saw that in such and such film. At the same time, as it can discredit a lot of things, to take away the public attention, it can also condition us to get ready for a future. Expect a future. It's full of this Blade Runner 1984 Minority Report sort of atmosphere, and just desensitizing people more and more to just expect a gulag totalitarian future where technology is just accepted as our master, rather than empowering us. And so, yeah, Hollywood is probably the single most decisive tool of technology to shape what we perceive. I'd like to start by discussing a bit of the films, we've each appreciated. Rollie, I don't know if you'd like to start, are any particular films, you grew up with or just had a strong impact on you that you'd like to share?
Sure, I'm a big Bruce Campbell fan. I like the Evil Dead movies a whole lot, and I like every B movie that he's ever done. I think that he's a great addition to the Spider-Man movies as well. I like Apocalypse.
Do you think it really taps into a lot of? Do you think it taps into a lot of the primal fear? When you get into that gore and even like zombie theme. I don't know. Is it just like that fight or flight survival mode sort of focus that you find fascinating, or what?
Absolutely, that fight or flight, because especially in my career, it's a lot of fight or flight. He eats me or I eat him. Sometimes you eat the bear, sometimes he eats you. I've always been fascinated by that as well, like especially Walking Dead movies where you got to walk around your perceived demons, and basically work around and always being in this, being always on edge, basically. I actually felt that way as a kid, like, because I was always like jumbled around a lot, feeling like on edge, like I don't know where I'm going to be tomorrow kind of thing. I don't know why I've always felt that, feeling when watching like zombie movies and stuff like that. But I've actually used Evil Dead in one of my articles to talk about Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, who actually retired as a full bird colonel because he talked about causing massive war to feed spirits that the military summoned during World War II, and you got to keep feeding them more and more with the war. And I actually used one of those GIFs, those short videos that run for 5 seconds in your article, showing the imagery of summoning experiences with Michael Aquino. But
were you a big fan of well, you mentioned Evil Dead in particular, huh? I mean, I know that recent series, I haven't kept up with it at all myself, but there's that Walking Dead. It's been popular these days. I don't know. Do you appreciate that at all, or no?
Yes, I do. I enjoy that a lot. The bad guy, the one with the bat and the leather, and he has the barbed wire around his bat. He actually told the main character of the show, the sheriff, you've been running a coop for a long, long time now, but this is a new world order, and I'm in charge. To that effect, So a lot of that New World Order stuff is actually in that Walking Dead series. Me and Bill actually talked about that, and we actually got into Max Brooks, which was actually Mel Brooks's son. He's tied into the Pentagon as well. He actually works for, these live shooter drills. It's I got an article that I've been putting on the back burner, but wanted to eventually release it. It has to do with these capstone exercises and zombie apocalypse writers. As retarded as it sounded, it actually exists. It's in Pentagon papers, or not the Pentagon papers, but actually in memos and stuff for the Pentagon releases.
All right. Yeah, it looks like we may have had some live transmission issues at the start of the show, but it's all being caught on recording for the archive. Hopefully the live feed will be all right. We'll just continue on though. Just announcing it for anyone out there who's experiencing technical issues. As far as the zombie films, I definitely think that has a strong sense of tapping into that survival mode. But there's also been a lot of talk of just psychological conditioning. It's almost like a metaphor when they'll use it in these they'll have like these stage trainings where people are all dressed up like zombies for zombie apocalypse, then these other people have to kill all the zombies or something, and what is this really doing? Is this conditioning people to be willing to kill the people who are on the outside of whatever given perimeter or whatever set of criteria are set up to define who gets to continue surviving in your community? And and who's left to the outer wasteland to be knocked off one by one. What did you think of the They Live original film, Rollie? Did you like They Live?
Oh, absolutely love it. You got Roddy Piper in there, and he actually was a fan of Renegade as well. He actually recommended on InfoWars to actually have Alex Jones to have a couple of Renegade hosts on his show. They Live was actually very well written, I believe, too, and it's a shame that Alex Jones has actually said we're the sunglass factory for They Live. That's us here at Renegade, not Mr. Jonesy. But They Live was actually a very good movie as well. I know the same film director directed also Halloween and other movies, and he also did a remake of the one when they have 4 kids that are actually aliens. What was called Dawn of something, I don't remember, but They Live and was definitely a very good film.
Yeah, I've always found it to be just a classic metaphor as well, for unveiling a lot of the truths we can find out with deeper research, and just how much things, are not so much what they appear and set up in our society to be to certain the advantage of certain individuals, but even just the whole idea of seeing things in a different way with those sunglasses, and that can be related to anything, just a new way of thinking, and being willing to look to new sources for your research, to find out who's really behind everything.
Yeah, and it could actually turn into a fight. Like, he literally tried to hand one of his construction buddies the glasses. Come on, look. You look at it, the signs say obey. Come on, man, look. He's like, hey, look at that shit, and walk away. Come on, man, look at it. It really feels that way sometimes with people. They're so stubborn. They don't want to see things from a new perspective, to the point where it's almost forcibly. And if you challenge anybody's belief system, they might actually want to fight you too.
Yeah, I mean, and then there are so many films like we grow up with, and we don't realize at first how much it's trying to reinforce official narratives. Regarding history. A big example, I'd say, is the Raiders of the Lost Ark Indiana Jones series. Just how much of history they're trying to shape. It's very Hebrew centric, isn't it? As far as the Old Testament, and of course there are these depictions of characters from Nazi Germany as like the enemy in some of them very, very strongly. It's it is very subtle. A lot of the times these things in the background are more important than the script itself. The Alien series, I found it interesting they combined that with Predator. I always liked, the action and just the idea of some of these other life forms that could exist, and in the warrior sort of states Alien and Predator were. So those are some of the big film series I liked. And when they combined the two, I found that interesting. They took it in a direction, that tapped into other theories. But when I look back now, that seems like it could be programming as well. The way they tapped into references to Egypt and the pyramids, and like our origin, because there are so many people with different agendas, wanting you to believe a certain lineage for how our ancestors came to this point, how much we're related to other races, and of course how much anything goes back to Egypt and Africa is highly debated. But yeah, I think the Indiana Jones series have a lot of historical propaganda.
You're absolutely right, and you hit the nail on the head in the beginning of your sentence. The Jews basically run the media, and they only portray themselves in the most favorable light. But if you look back at Neil Gabler's work, he said the Jews didn't take over Hollywood. They made Hollywood. They created American idealism. They created, America itself is a very idealistic nation. It might be the most idyllic nation there is in the world, and it's reinforced by films and TV. For example, in Soviet Russia, the NKVD, they didn't have the illusionary machine. They didn't have the TV. They didn't have the silver screen. All they could do to you was give you a bullet to the back of your head. They didn't have the propaganda that we have right now, where you don't even know that it's propaganda. And one of the men that have access to inside the Pentagon, who's a film producer, one of 12 that could actually freely take his badge and swipe his card and just walk into Langley, is John Rizzo. And he wrote a book called Company Man, and it's a very self-serving book, because he is a company man, of course, hence the title, right? But he said in the book that the CIA sprinkles in CIA agents everywhere in Hollywood, which is very interesting. Did you ever see Jennifer Gardner, who was married to Ben Affleck, actually do a CIA commercial on their official CIA Gov website? Did you catch that, Richard?
No. Yeah, I did not.
It's she has like a little head, it's a cut screen, and then it's a whole globe of all this interactive stuff going on, super secret spy stuff, and then top secret flashes. And she says, "I'm Jennifer Gardner, and I play a CIA agent on TV, but I want to recruit you for the CIA. It's a great career with great people." Of course, she was married to Ben Affleck for a number of years, 12 in total. After the whole Benifer thing, God, I really didn't want to bring that back up. But Ben Affleck actually said something very interesting in himself when he was filming Argo. He said, there could be CIA agents everywhere in Hollywood, and we just wouldn't know it. It kind of like this look, like no duh, And actually, Argo was actually about CIA agents inside of Iran, posing as Canadian film makers to bring out some hostages back. This idea that they hate our freedom so much, all that you got to do is pretend like you're Canadian. It's kind of ridiculous anyways. But the person that actually announced the award for Best Film for Argo was no other than Michelle Obama.
That's rather unexpected, but okay. And as far as the some of the other examples, that you'd say of some of your favorite, films or series of films.
I like Apocalypse Now. I know we're going to touch on it a little bit, but it matches like realism, and surrealism, as one and the same.
Okay. And you mentioned Platoon as well. I'm not familiar. Actually, I should have watched Apocalypse Now. I know, but I actually did not. But I know we had touched on a number of pieces earlier. I forgot to mention another one, actually, though, myself. I'd say 2001, just with the whole idea of Hal, it has to be mentioned there.
Are you going against me? I can't allow that. That's a great movie too, And of course, he did a Vietnam movie, Stanley Kubrick. He did Full Metal Jacket, and he said that he wanted to see what it would take for somebody to get so programmed mentally to want to go over a hill and maybe even point of no return to die for a principle, And that's
the one I'm probably
Vietnam
most
film.
It is. It is.
And,
but also at the same time, a lot of these films are, making sure to portray, the U.S. military role in the most positive light. Never at all on the wrong side of morality or justice. And of course, the Predator, the original Predator film, the same thing. You had, this commando unit in there. But I mean, it's very clear-cut good and evil roles as far as how we're supposed to see our military. That's definitely is always in there. But no, those were and in Full Metal Jacket, I can confirm myself. From a number of times, I did appreciate that one to get an idea. I mean, even never being in the military, it's some of these films can really at least be the next closest thing to give someone an idea of what that kind of life and person lifestyle that you're taking on, irreversibly, really, is and consists of. A lot of other, I don't know, similar films really get me where it just gives you a glimpse into a life that you otherwise would never comprehend. I mentioned earlier to you, No Country for Old Men. Now, I find, the writing team still, from my investigations, questionable at least, the Coen brothers. And I haven't really seen much of their other works. But, I must say when I originally saw it, it was very impactful to me. It had a strong impact on me in that you got to see how much some of these people who might have just a murderous lifestyle as their just way of going from day to day, as almost just a nomadic murderous lifestyle, can perceive things and deal with situations, and just maybe just a little glimpse at how their mind can work and how it can rationalize, based on at least whatever baggage it had, before that to bring to the table. But it at the same time, it does also that film seems to cheapen life at the same time. And it certainly portrays the United States as having gone horribly wrong in recent times, as if people like this didn't used to exist, who would be so cold, and it to be such a rough world, basically, into the future. But I'm not so sure it was a gradual process. This is just how some would like us to perceive it. That there was just a certain flaw, and maybe it was, I don't know, is this trying to say something against just the United States way, maybe even anti-capitalist? Who knows what some of the messages are there? I don't know. Do you know much else of the Coen brothers and their past? As much as it is a very well-made film, and I think the supporting actor in particular, he had a very impressive acting performance in the role. But I'm as far as the writers, I'm suspicious of their motives and the kind of messages they're sending, at the same time as being able to appreciate a well done film. But I don't know. You have much opinion at all on the Coen brothers, Rollie?
Yeah, Tommy Lee Jones was that supporting actor that you were referring to, and he delivers a great line inside of that film. When I got a little bit older, I always thought that God would just come into my life. Well, hell, he didn't. But I don't blame him, though. Absolutely great film.
Well, actually, the acting performance that I liked the most was actually of the actual murderer, Javier Bardem. I just thought that, the way he captured that character was very convincing and very, very, very well played and portrayed by him. But yeah, no, as far as the past of the actor you're referring to, Tommy, that's just on the level of acting skills, and I was impressed with his depiction to get in the mind of someone like that. But your reference to Tommy Lee Jones, that reminds me of the information you sent me, and you found that Tommy Lee Jones from No Country for Old Men, his cousin Chase Brandon. Chase Brandon was the CIA liaison officer. He was the CIA liaison officer from 1996 to 2008.
Yep, he was the first public liaison officer for the CIA, and if you go to their website, they would actually refer to you to him, and he would give you what's called star access. You know, whatever that means. You know, it's a lot of Hollywood producers and actors go to his office to get favoritism. He was the first one in '96, and Oliver Stone said that the reason that they made a liaison officer publicly and officially was because of his JFK movie, which is interesting, but because Tommy Lee Jones actually played Clay Shaw in that movie. You know, the only CIA personnel who was implicated for the murder of John F. Kennedy in that movie, and by Garrett over in New Orleans. So yeah, that's really interesting that Tommy Lee Jones, his cousin, is a CIA agent, and a very, very famous one at that. He actually does the conspiracy circuit too, and every time he does the conspiracy circuit, nobody presses on him on those issues. He just goes on and says, "I think I got the truth of what happened to Roswell." You know, he goes on a George Norrie show, and never ever mentions that he's CIA. That you could go to the official CIA.gov and see his face and see who he is and talk about star access, and that never comes up on the conspiracy circuit conversation. But he removed his website, and he actually got Robert De Niro to actually play him in the movie Meet the Fockers. Remember Robert De Niro played this overbearing CIA agent? That's Chase Brandon. That's who that character was based off of. You know, that movie happened in the 2000s, you know, where, like, it made it hip and cool that mass surveillance, you know, was going on, spying on his Jewish future son-in-law, then boyfriend, you know. And the character that played the boyfriend, you know, that was meeting the Fockers, Ben Stiller, went to his office and saw a bunch of torture manuals and saw him with Mujahideen characters.
Eyes of the future seen from their past, from Big Bang to Wimber, and it all sounds the same.
Here's Jewish professor Noel Ignatieff.
My concern is doing away with whiteness. Whiteness is a form of racial oppression, sure. The suggestion is that it is somehow possible to separate whiteness from oppression, and it is not. There can be no white race without the phenomenon of white supremacy. In the same way, if you abolish racial oppression, you do away with whiteness. Treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity.
Your views are fairly well received in academia.
Yes, they're legitimate, not to say that everyone agrees, but sure. And the task is to bring this minority together in such a way that it makes it impossible for the legacy of whiteness to continue to reproduce itself.
With your hair reflecting roses, your kiss Medusa's touch, turn to a pillar of salt, to dine out would be perfection. Then my loneliness closes in, so I drink a German wine, and drift in dreams of other lives and greater times, and drift in dreams of other lives and greater times. my mind, drunken thoughts of wounds and men. Why does the devil pass?
And we're back talking here today with Rollie Quaid. Rollie, I thought I'd mention this one email you sent me where you point out a very interesting connection with Robert Mercer. You mentioned
about.
Yeah. Well, no, I mean you just mentioned a connection with James Cameron. Maybe you mentioned Robert Mercer of Renaissance, the AI company. He controlled Breitbart News and Cambridge Analytica. They own the Terminator gun Arnold movie. I don't know if it's the rights you're talking about, but as far as James Cameron, that brought up the subject we got on the discussion, earlier. And being the director of Terminator and a lot of other films, I'd like you, when you have a chance, to go into a little more to, your thoughts on James Cameron's influence on us. But if there's more you'd like to mention on these government agencies' influence in general on Hollywood, shaping our perception of things, I don't know, where would you like to take it? We have quite a few other topics I wanted you to get to, so whatever you think would be best to continue.
Sure, absolutely. I'll go into James Cameron. I was going to say that he actually has the Terminator gun on display. I'm not sure which exact one it was from Terminator 1 or Terminator 2, but he has it in his, his personal museum and effects to show off the guests at his house. And having a gun is kind of it's like a phallic symbol, it's like having power, and he's this guy in an AI company, Renaissance, that's data mining all our information, and using it as talking points and political campaigns through Cambridge Analytica. But James Cameron is somebody who really complexes me. He had military support for the Alien films, and he supposedly did not have military support for Terminator, the first one in the 80s, and then Terminator 2 Judgment Day. He didn't have support for those two movies. That was very anti-authoritarian, very anti, nuclear, because, for example, you got Sarah Connor envisioning that she's in a gate and holding the gate, and she turns into an ashtray, These were very independent films, the author of the book that I've been reading describes. But he says in Terminator: The Rise of Machines, there's a shift in that. It's very pro-nuclear. We could just bomb a country, no big deal, for an example. And the terrorists, these rogue nations, are could give us global viruses, something to that effect. It's not as good as the first two, but it does have good scenes, like Arnold holding a coffin with a Gatling gun and spraying hot lead. Any movie that has that, I'm gonna like. But it's interesting because Henry Kissinger talked about recently that I'm tempted to just nuke North Korea, and that's something that's going on in 2018 that he just said 2 months ago. And Terminator 1 and 2 was very anti-Reagan, very anti-Star Wars, which is a program that poured out of the Reagan administration. It's really interesting that George Lucas named his movie Star Wars, isn't it? But,
Well, what came first, the chicken or the egg? Maybe you're suggesting. I mean, because I always assumed, of course, the first film at least was around first, and after 77 was it, or 78 or whatever, when Star Wars came out, then that they used that term to define this defense. It's basically a defense system to be able to shoot incoming threats out of the sky, right?
Right, exactly. That might actually turn into an interesting article idea. I might actually research which one came first, the chicken or the egg, in terms of the Star Wars program. But go ahead.
Oh, no. Yeah, continue with what else you wanted to say about. I want to move on to Oliver Stone, but first, more on James Cameron, his films, Terminator, Aliens, the messages maybe that behind these, and I don't know. You think that Terminator was more anti-establishment, Aliens, not as much, basically.
Yeah, and I don't even mind that. Sigourney Weaver's character was a part of a military vessel. If that's part of the film, that makes a great film. Military personnel make great characters for film. I agree with that.
And a lot of these that have a few sequels, a lot of these that have quite a few sequels, there'll be some cases where the agenda changes, right, in the second or third film onward. Not quite the same, and the messages start to be different. Eventually we saw Alien and Predator have certain films that merged, the Alien versus Predator and all that. And I was mentioning the connections to Egypt and, to trying to, connect our past to aliens to explain things and this and that.
Yeah, exactly right. In the 1980s, it was very anti-Soviet, for example. And then when the Soviet Union just kind of collapsed, the film industry was like, hot damn, we got to come up with an enemy. And we're the sole unchecked superpower in the 1990s. It's before 9/11 happened. So we got to make some enemies. So let's put in disaster movies. And a couple of Godzilla and Independence Day were attacked by some other from the unknown. So exactly right, And when the American mission changes, the films that are produced actually change to kind of facilitate what's going on in the world. And the entertainment liaison officer for the Department of Defense, because they have different liaison officers for different agencies. There's not just the CIA liaison. Philip Shreve was asked, are films damage control? And he said, absolutely. We don't want to be vilified, something to that effect. Like he doesn't want to hand out an aircraft carrier for Sigourney Weaver to come up with a movie, countermeasures, which talks about Iran-Contras. He said to the effect of that movie before scrapping the script that we're not going to give you an aircraft carrier to bring back something that hawkens on Americans' emotions about the Iran-Contra scandal. So many movies didn't get made because they couldn't get a hold of military hardware because they don't want their personal, to them belongings. It's the taxpayer paid for that hardware. And it really makes you wonder, Richard, why exactly do we pay so much money on films? When we pay to see all these Tomahawk, missiles being shot, into they CGI some of that, but and helicopters and jets and stuff like that. That's taxpayer owned. Why do we have to pay to watch that on a screen? And then to know that several of the actors that are paid really, really well are actually CIA assets, agents, or even officers. In the case of George Clooney and Anna Jolie, they're actually CFR and they're actually CIA officers as well.
Well, the connections with the government agencies and the movie-making industry does explain a lot. When I really think about other factors I've observed, I spent a number of years living in spending a lot of time the more downtown, heavy downtown part of Chicago. and I've always noticed, for that entire 10-year period, I'd be there like day in and day out. It was mostly business area, it was mostly businesses, not too many residentials, and it was a very popular neighborhood for Hollywood films to be shooting on location. They'd have all their white trucks set up, and they'd be there for anywhere from hours to number of days. But it would always fascinate me just how much the city would cave in, to every little whim and demand, shut down, entire blocks, close off, making the already horrible traffic so much worse, for everyone else. And, as much as we're paying in taxes as it is, all for the benefit of these movie sets. And they're so focused on profit and where they put their money. I have to imagine that, there are, other connections helping to pull strings other than just financially to make all this work. And to be so much a propaganda piece, in bed with all these government agencies, explains a lot, and how all of these movie-making film sets can, have such access to major business sectors of such a heavy metropolis, shutting down, large amounts and giving higher precedence than the residents who actually pay with their tax dollars for the city's functions,
Yeah, you're exactly right. On location, locals have to cave in to the demand of these Hollywood stars. It goes to show you that we're a cult of personality just as much as North Korea is with their leaders. We worship them. We just have a larger pantheon than they do in North Korea. I watched this Jennifer Lopez movie where they were actually making fun of this idea that Hollywood stars move into a town and the whole town has to basically cave into every whim they have. For an example, like Jennifer Lopez demanded to have bottled water in a time where bottled water wasn't popular because it was like in the late 90s. And they took some tap water and poured it into a bottle, put the top on and took a lighter, and then took the lighter all around the top to seal it and gave it to her. It's absolutely ridiculous, and how people see Hollywood as the stars, in the sky. That they're above reproach, and that they deserve these large salaries, and they might as well just put made by the Department of Defense and CIA in the beginning of these titles, because they're getting so much support. They might as well just be called assets.
Oh yeah, a lot of the action films, like that series of racing films. What is it, Fast and Furious or whatever? I could never watch any of these things myself. The disaster films as well. I never really could get myself to watch much any of them. I didn't watch Independence Day. I don't know. So I just have a low tolerance for a lot of that. But yeah, it's just fascinating. Go ahead.
I don't know if Fast and Furious had the Pentagon behind it, but it's interesting how the first movie was everybody's part of one gang, and it's multiracial, and it's a bunch of free love, involved with Fast and Furious. Like your girl could be my girl next day, and everybody's cool with it, sort of thing. That's not how gangs function. They're racial, you know what I mean? And they try to sell this idea, and they try to sell it to white audiences as well. And you're never going to believe this, Richard. But we're talking about the subject of Department of Defense being involved with movies. Marvel did not actually produce the first Hawk movie. It was actually licensed to the Pentagon. They provided the script and everything, and not just the vehicles.
That is the topic I wanted you to comment on next, Rollie, because these superhero films have been just getting bigger and bigger in recent years, and there's so much propaganda, so social, politically correct conditioning, just so much that's embedded in these, so many agendas. It's so obvious, especially to those of us who've been around a few more years.
The director for the first Hawk, not to be confused with the Norris film that was later on, but it actually was directed by Ug Lee, who was a Taiwan director for Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon film, or maybe I said that backwards, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. I didn't see no damn dragons or tigers in that movie, but he also directed Brokeback Mountain too. Why would they get a director from Taiwan to direct that movie? God knows why. But that Hawk 2003 movie is very interesting because the military did not want to perceive as trying to kill Bruce Banner, who turned into the Incredible Hawk. The mission is simply to just capture him. And they didn't want to leave out certain references to be, genetic engineered soldiers and, enhanced in a laboratory. The DOD actually has research laboratories about behavior modification. So they don't want that in films whatsoever. But his father actually turned into like Absorbing Man. I can't remember his name, but full steam ahead, fire everything you got at the villain, but just try to capture Bruce Banner, get him alive. And they wanted to have like the Hawk throw cars on the soldiers to generate sympathy, so they could up the next level of force. But that particular film and a couple other films were actually produced by the Pentagon. It was actually Iron Man, who was the first movie produced by Marvel.
Yeah, I mean, the entire comic book genre, to some extent I've been suspicious of for quite some years. Maybe not in its infancy, but by the time they were making films, you started to see a bit of agendas soon enough. You mentioned like in the Fast and Furious series, promoting a lot of the race mixing, for example, and you see a lot of that in the superhero films, of course, and just this globalist, anti-nationalist sort of an implication, that you need this one world, altruistic government in the future to fight evil or something, is a common theme.
Yep, and they did that a lot with Transformers, and of course, they pre-wrote the script and already shook hands with the Pentagon about how the movie was made before the even screenplay director started writing it. But they had John Valton, who's actually Anna Jolie's father, actually play, I think it was Secretary of Defense in that movie, or maybe he was a general or something. I don't remember which one. Did you remember me talking about Joseph Camp, who was Jolie's great uncle? He used to call into Michael Collins Piper's show a lot and wonder where she went wrong in life. He actually wrote a book saying that certain Jewish groups are going around actually using graffiti of swastikas all around college campuses in the 1960s. That was revolutionary for that time, making pamphlets like that. But he never liked John Vaught. And John Vaught in this particular Transformer movie, he saw that the soldiers were in harm and they were in a desert fighting like some sort of scorpion spider monkey type hybrid. And he was like, we got to get the troops out of there. And they commented on this national security cinema, there's no such interest in troops. You fight until you're dead, kind of thing. You don't withdraw from battle. You know what I mean? But they try to get the troops.
I thought we could touch on. Go ahead.
Yep. Go ahead, Richard.
Well, no, I thought we could touch on Oliver Stone's connections. and you know, the references you were making to just a lot of these agendas and government agencies in the start of the second hour, but you know, leading up to that, I mean, I don't know if you could mention more about just rounding off. You know, I mean, was there propaganda in some of your favorite films? Like, I mean, Apocalypse Now, even if I think of some of the earlier war films, do you think there's propaganda in that the more you look at it in retrospect, you know, messages that it's sending out?
For Apocalypse Now, I just saw the movie just recently called Into the Heart of Darkness. My buddy always told me that the documentary of how they made the movie is actually better than the movie itself. And I would have to concur with that fact, because Francis Coppola actually directed the 1972 movie The Godfather, and he directed this particular movie, Apocalypse Now. And he really put himself in that, you know, this idea of a collective, you know, insanity going on set, you know, where actually the actors felt like they were, you know, having some sort of like entrapment inside the film, like Stockwell syndrome. You know, I got this, you know, vision and nobody sees my vision. I'm making a $20 million disaster. Nobody fucking understands me. I want to fucking kill myself. You know, he said that a lot. And you could really see that he's Willard, you know, Sheen, you know, Martin Sheen, Charlie Sheen's dad. And he's also Marlon Brando, who was also in Godfather, you know, Coots, this military officer that Charlie Sheen's character was ordered to kill, you know, because he went rogue, you know, and he's not obeying the orders of the Pentagon anymore. And he actually has his own village where he's personally God. And he's having trouble with exactly his vision is. And you got crazy Dennis Hopper, you know, this journalist guy with a camera, you know, singing his virtues all the time, you know. Like, man, he did this and that, and then there's like blood everywhere, you know what I mean? People are really going to remember what's going on in the jungles of Vietnam, or actually it was Cambodia. I'm not sure if they were actually aware of that, but Sheen's character was.
Are there any other films that you had always admired, appreciated, and in later years you realize more of the propaganda that's laden in the writing?
Yeah, I was actually writing this show that we're doing tonight the same time that I was doing this article about kind of trash talk between Conor McGregor and 50 Cent. I got to thinking that they say in the, you know, in movies and stuff a lot that whites really are not fighters. They're more blacks. You know, they're civil rights fighters. You know, blacks could talk about their race like conquering giants, but white people need to be submissive. And you kind of see that in movies a lot, but then they want you to go fight and get geared up. But then when you come home, they want you to be quiet and just be part of the corporate system and just be smart enough to punch in a time clock. I see that in a lot of films, and you know, it's a little bit in that with Oliver Stone movies. For example, in the movie Scarface, you know, it's led like a lot of young men astray, you know, thinking that snorting coke and breaking laws is cool, you know, that you could be rich like Scarface and until the time that you go out and you die young kind of thing. And, you know, my cousin Billy talks about young men in prison that get swept away by Oliver Stone's, you know, movie, because he actually written the movie Scarface. And that has to be one of the ones that really turned me off to Oliver Stone, where I didn't really see him as being this great film director, part of this liberati of directors that never got the straitjacket or never tied down. You know, I kind of see through the shell a little bit more with him.
Well, you mentioned that your impression is that Platoon had military backing, no matter what Oliver Stone says. You say that he's military?
Yeah, he had Captain Del Dye to actually be a consultant on there. And they took him to the Philippines, where they directed not only Batum, but they directed Apocalypse Now there as well. And they wanted to scare the shit out of Charlie Sheen, which is Martin Sheen's son, and Batum. And they had Johnny Depp, and they had a ton of actors that weren't big at the time, but became really famous. And he really wanted to instill with them, trauma. This is what war's like. This is what it's like to be in the shit. And they made fun of it a little bit in the parody movie Tropical Thunder, which I always thought was a funny movie to encapsulate all these Vietnam movies as well. But, yeah, I really think there's military backing in that movie. Maybe it's not nefarious. Maybe they were just trying to say that when soldiers come home, they got, shell shock. They didn't call it post-traumatic stress disorder back then. But that's exactly what it is, so that you can understand what a vet is going through. And, all the flashes through the scene, maybe they meant well. Maybe it wasn't mean to traumatize the audience.
Well, I'd like to cover more of some of these primary connections to the government agencies, including what you mentioned, like the big three noteworthy gentlemen to a lot of these agencies. You mentioned Michael Moore, Oliver Stone, and then you mentioned Paul Rothchild, right?
Oh, Rothschild was the producer for The Doors. It's actually, his name is Paul Leverhoven. He's considered by this book that I've been referring to, this National Security Cinema, as the three, liberal film directors that are unfeathered by the government or the CIA. And he directed the movie, and I'm referring to Paul Leverhoven, Total Recall, where I actually got my nickname Quaid from, because you got Arnold Schwarzenegger in that movie. And people that on my fight team say that my whole life was a conspiracy. I'm always talking about conspiracy theories. And so they gave me the name Quaid, and plus I'm big too, And
let's pick up with that article after the break.
Want to travel south this year. Won't prevent safe passage here. Why you act crazy?
Our hosts here at Renegade Broadcasting do a great job presenting to you cutting-edge and hard-hitting content every day of the week. They do this all for free because they care about getting the truth out there and ensuring that we and future generations have a future worth living for. Our enemies have an endless supply of money to finance their operations, but we're able to work wonders working on a shoestring budget. If you appreciate a host's content, visit their archive page and find out how to support them, or even send a nice thank you note. We all appreciate it. Thank you for your consideration. Now back to the show.
I got balls dragged on me into the chasm gaping we. Mirrors multi-reflecting this between spunk-stained sheet and odorous whim. Hammer eye flick shudder within, assist me to walk away in sin. Where is the string that Theseus laid? Find me out this labyrinth play. I can burn,
Broadcasting.
Oh, Rollie, before the break, we were touching on the three who are liaisons, which are virtually unrestricted by the government agencies. And yeah, you mentioned Michael Moore, Oliver Stone, and you were just discussing a bit about Paul Rothschild before the break. And your article, you've decided to publish it with a bit of a time concern with this broadcast. Decided on the Tribune to release it today. Pressed a bit for time, I know, but Opening the Doors of Perception, Oliver Stone and Val Kilmer at Laurel Canyon. So please take it away, sir.
Yeah, sure. So we just touched on that Oliver Stone directed this 1986 film called Platoon, which was ironic because it was the same year that Top Gun came out. And Val Kilmer was in the film Doors that was written and directed by Oliver Stone in 93. So you got Val Kilmer, who played this ace called Iceman nickname, you know, young, dumb, and full of cum kind of jokes. You know, that's not a good joke, but that's actually what they say in the film. And, you know, sort of content. And, you know, this uber gay volleyball scene that's in the middle that was unnecessary in Top Gun. And it was a recruitment, you know, to join the Navy, you know, or the Air Force too, you know, because they did, fly jets, you know.
Totally. It was totally selling that as a great career. You know, I was very young when it came out. I know my father was a fan of it. You know, he thought the film was a good American military film, you know, and all that. And, you know, and yeah, entertaining. And yeah, there's just so much propaganda about how we're supposed to depict our military and that sort of career choice to be admired and possibly pursued, right?
They were actually going to have Val Kilmer back on Top Gun 2 in the 1990s, you know, the same year that he actually worked on The Doors. But the problem was the Navy was going through a massive scandal called the Tailhook scandal, which involved like over 100 men or 100 women that were being assaulted, you know, on these naval ships, and 7 men. So the movie was gutted, you know, so it wasn't in the national interest to produce the Top Gun film 2, much to the dismay of filmgoers that would have loved that film. So he didn't work on military propaganda. He worked on this movie that immortalized Jim Morrison from The Doors, which I always found odd that Oliver Stone would be interested in making such movie as a vet, you know. This flower power, you know, peace child being immortalized. I always thought he was the antithesis of everything that he stands for, being a war vet, you know.
Why
volunteered.
So why the big interest in the Doors film for Oliver Stone then? Do you suspect?
It has to do with some sort of propaganda. You know, it's a major head scratcher for me. And why would he hook up with Paul Rothchild, the producer of the Doors, and try to weed out who's the perfect role for Jim Morrison, no other than Val Kilmer? And why would they think that he's the perfect guy for the job after playing military roles? I have no idea why they would produce that film or even make
they did. I don't know. If I were to speculate, I mean, I know they seem to have a strong association in that film of depicting, you know, the rock stars with this very self-destructive sort of energy that, you know, was just expected to go hand in hand, you know, that lifestyle meant that. I think there's even some line in the film where Val Kilmer depicting Jim Morrison is saying, give me some death, if I'm not mistaken, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Like, you remember This Is the End, which they actually used for the soundtrack for Apocalypse Now about Vietnam. And remember,
the way he was found dead in the bathtub in the film, you know, just everything about it. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Right.
I didn't mean to interrupt.
This Is the End song. Remember, at the end, he's saying "kill, kill, kill," and in that movie or that particular song, you know, you hear, the killer was walking down the hall. And he went to his father, you know, or his brother or something, kept walking down the hall. And then he goes to his mother and says, and his father, you know, "Father, I want to kill you. And Mother, I want to fuck you," you know. So there has to be some sort of CIA, MK Ultra trauma that was, you know, was intentional in that movie. Especially since it was partly filmed at Laurel Canyon, which was a military installation.
And so much is usually left on the cutting room floor compared to any previous novel or screenplay, as far as what they could actually fit in the film. You know, especially with regard to dialogue, they have to be very selective. So, yeah, when you think of how much negativity and, you know, death-themed content was included that by Oliver Stone's choice in the Doors film, it certainly shows the sort of generation, that they'd like that to influence in the future. You know, I mean, the government wants a very self-destructive, introspective sort of population, too consumed with their own, wasting away. That they won't really focus on the exploitation and the corruption of the people who are overlording above them, right?
Yep, I absolutely agree with that statement. You know, and Jim Morrison was obsessed with Aleister Crowley, and his dad was a military man too. You know, he was an admiral on the ship that actually oversees, the Gulf of Tonkin. You know, he was the admiral for that particular vessel. And you kind of wonder if his father or his parents were part of an Aleister Crowley cult themselves and actually reared him in at a young age. You know, it's a very good cover, you know, being a man in uniform to have those sort of beliefs, you know.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, we see a lot of ties, between the rock stars and the Hollywood, big film stars. I mean, we were referencing, I think, recently. Well, no, we did talk about, the connections and close relationships, such as that of Marilyn Manson with Johnny Depp. When we were mentioning the video, Manson was shooting, Johnny Depp was hanging out with him. So, I mean, to this day, I mean, we do see a lot of these same types who are well, I mean, you've mentioned Manson's connections. I don't know. Have you shared that with the audience much?
Yeah, and of course, Johnny Depp was in the film Platoon that we were just referencing. That was one of his big debut. But I actually shared it in one of my articles talking about Trump sacrifice, and I'm actually waiting for Easter to write an article, one of these unpublished articles that I've been saving for a rainy day. Easter, we're going to be celebrating the death and the resurrection of Christ. I'm going to actually write an article talking about the coming Illuminati sacrifice of President Trump. Not that necessarily I want anything like that, but talking about, like, in culture, that it's been generated, this idea to sacrifice Trump. And Marilyn Manson was one of these individuals that actually made a movie with Johnny Depp where they cut off Trump's head, and he actually had a run-in with Trump's people one time at the Trump Towers. I'm a little bit gray on actually what transpired then. But then also you got Kathy Griffin, who did a head-chopping video, ISIS style, they say, of a effigy of Donald Trump's head. I got a different article coming out talking about Trump's connection with Madonna and Kathy Griffin that you might find fascinating. I'm going to put Donald Trump, Agents of Chaos, and talk about these two women who are actually connected to Rob Goldstein, who has Russian, Putin Russia connections and Donald Trump connections. And they were seen both with pictures of this particular gentleman, Goldstein, who's this tabloid expert. I think he's based in London. And it makes me wonder if he actually told these two women to say certain things that are very provocative to kind of distract, the level of hatred that Trump's getting. That's a possibility as well.
Yeah.
But
and you mentioned,
like
Depp was on the set partying with Manson during the shooting of his beheading video, right?
Right, exactly.
Kyle did a great expose on Johnny Depp's portrayal of Hunter S. Thompson. Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas. It was one of those films that gives you a glimpse into the life of eccentric personas like I was describing earlier. But yeah, it definitely has all of what Kyle had elaborated upon as far as the there's like a desensitization to any morality or ethics. I mean, just being okay with an adrenal gland lying around and being used as a drug, for example, and not minding who needed to die unjustly to obtain that, things like that. Of course, the child and just the exploitation of these underage people for sexual adventures. A lot of these sort of like connotations that the film had, and I mean, there's a lot of propaganda I could see in selling a lifestyle like that as well. So I could see the government tied to a film such as Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and I could see them really liking Hunter S. Thompson as far as the message that the CIA wants upon the public, right?
Yeah, exactly. And this idea that drugs actually enhance your writing abilities, no, they don't. It hinders that shit. For an example, like they promote this idea that DMT, will actually make you more creative. That's something that Joe Rogan has been echoing a lot too. With Hunter S. Thompson, though, I always was confused why exactly he hated Nixon so much. Maybe he needed a hobby, because Nixon, when he was VP to Eichmann himself, basically made the black market in America, and Thompson was a drug addict. Shouldn't he like that? And Yeah, that film was actually ridiculous. I wanted to stop watching it. My buddy recommended it to me one time, and there's a scene where, like, he has jizz on his pants, and he's just sitting there and talking about a film of what perverts are like. It's somebody who has exactly that, and he looks down at his pants and is like, oh, man, And, yeah, Johnny Depp is an interesting character. Do you remember Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory remake that he was in? This weird, like, pedophilic aura to him. Like, when I saw him,
I saw some of the advertised clips for the film, and it did have that creepy vibe as you described there. No, I didn't catch that. I mean, I caught more of his like intermediate films when he was, establishing himself more in film and some of his earlier work, but not too much of the late. I mean, Ed Wood, I'm familiar with that. He does seem like he almost may do method acting. I wouldn't rule out when he studies a role, but yeah, there is a bit of a darkness to what he's drawn to. I mean, to each their own to some extent with that. He is a brilliant actor, but when you look at the people behind the producing and writing, that's really those are really the people who are in bed with the government.
I kid you not. Take a picture of Roger Stone and take a picture of Depp in the role of Willy Wonka and put them side by side. And it has to be a picture where Stone is wearing a top hat and glasses and smiling. They look a lot alike, and it's creepy, I know that Depp had to get dentures put in because he has meth mouth, from all these years of partaking, in it and being a heavy smoker. He actually one time destroyed his apartment and blamed it on like a raccoon that broke into his apartment or something like that.
Well, it is very extreme characters. I mean, even in the film I mentioned, Ed Wood, him portraying the writer-director Ed Wood, who was a cross-dresser, and then affiliated with Bela Lugosi, and they depict his heroin habit as well in the film, and kind of try to look empathetically toward it and this to that. So I mean, it did focus a lot on the the more questionable side of Hollywood, even in that film, depicting that real life director. But that at least was a documentary. As I say, though, I'm just not as convinced the actors have as much influence and power, like him, as much as the the producers and writers do.
Producers have immense power.
Right.
For example, they're the men that hold the puppet, strings and pull the puppet itself on the backdrop of flames and hellfire, they have the smirk.
You want to mention more about Oliver Stone in particular? Because I mean, you had this article you just released today. So I mean, are there more key points from the article and Stone's, potential government connections that you could speculate on?
Yeah, so he filmed at Laurel Canyon, which was interesting to me because Stone, didn't have any Sunset Strip, songs to write about in Vietnam. And he took Val Kilmer there to really embody the character of Jim Morrison. And he was picked by Paul Rothchild, who knew him from the Slap Boys. And the Slap Boys was starred Kilmer, Kevin Bacon, and Sean Penn, Sean Penn's very connected to Oliver Stone in a lot of work he does. Not just El Chape movie that never was officially made, in the U-Turn movie, but he has deep connections to Paul Rothschild as well, and they're buddies, and a lot of people in the conspiracy culture movement or truth movement, whatever you want to call ourselves, don't realize his connections. And I was wondering, because of his military connection, was he able to gain access into the Laurel Canyon's facility and actually go to the next level of MK Ultraing Val Kilmer for his role, because Val Kilmer has never left the role of Jim Morrison. You know, he had to get psychiatric treatment from when he was at the Sunstrip, you know. And I put in a video of him doing an interview, and he's just out of it. Did you catch that last video that I put about Val Kilmer?
No, I didn't catch that yet. No.
He was doing a Hollywood interview that was a totally non sequitur, and he was like, the trees and the nature, they all have one voice, and you could hear the barracuda. All these animals are gonna die before my children grow. You know, doing like a Jim Morrison poem. You know what I mean? And he asked you like how excited you are for this next film. You know what I mean? You know, the reporter did. You know, so Val Kilmer is not right whatsoever. Did you remember that Batman and Robin movie? He actually was selected, and Tim Burton produced that movie as well. That's a very disturbed mind if you watch that particular movie. I know a lot of you probably try to psychologically block that movie out of your head, but they had Jim Carrey as the Riddler, and they had Tommy Lee Jones as Two-Face, and as I mentioned, that his cousin was actually the liaison officer to the CIA for many, many years, from 96 to 2008. And I've talked about this before, you know, Roger Stone, you know, playing this role of the Joker, you know, against Elliot Spitzer, right? Where if you're going against, like, the inmates of Arkham Asylum, because that's where Batman drops you off when you go to jail, right? Takes you to Arkham Asylum. And most of the villains, you know, like Mr. Freeze, Poison Ivy, had this fixation on Batman to the point of homicidal tendencies. And Jim Carrey's character, the Riddler, actually makes this device to be able to read minds so that he could find the true identity of Batman, because he's super obsessed with him, right? He finally gets in Batman's mind and realizes that Batman's mind is actually darker than his is. You know, it makes him absolutely crazy. And this is Val Kilmer's mind that I'm referring to. And Batman's character, Bruce Wayne, his real identity, is dating a psychiatrist, and he got the psychiatrist to go see Jim Carrey's character, the Riddler, at Arkham's Asylum to make sure that he's not going to divulge Batman's true identity. And he's in a straitjacket that's half off, and she asks the question, do you know who Batman is? And then Jim Carrey starts screaming and flapping in a straitjacket, I'm Batman, you know. So, like, these guys, you know, that do method acting, they're deeply disturbed, you know what I mean? They should be in Arkham Asylum. Have you ever heard the phrase that the lunatics are running the asylum, you know, referring to who's in charge of this country? That's so true. They need to be in Arkham's Asylum, and they need to get the treatment they need, even if that means lobotomizing them, you know?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, yeah, so it's like, I don't know, very curious as far as just the whole career. I was just looking more at your article where you're talking, you know, about the Oliver Stone's choice of films. Yeah, you just suspected the Doors were not funded by the government because it strayed from the common focus.
I don't think the Pentagon funded it, but you got to remember the CIA is a different bird. It's a different entity. You know, that sometimes they have different agendas. Like the CIA is very interested in cultural creation. You know, they like this sort of, you know, asexual, pansexual kind of culture where black is white and white is black, and we're really all one and the same. And are you familiar with the name Gordon Watson? He was actually part of the MK Ultra program and adept to Aleister Crowley. He actually went to see shamans in different places to figure out how they control their particular tribes. You know, this is the CIA. This is what they're interested in. You know what I mean? And then out you get this flower power movement of let's all live a communal life, man, be free from the system. But you're getting welfare checks, man. You're not really free from the system. All these hippies were getting welfare checks. Do you remember Nancy Pelosi, who was talking to a crowd of college-age students, like, pursue your dreams. Don't worry too hard about your education. We're going to pay for you to play guitar, encouraging welfare. I'll have to send you that video, Richard. It's still being even echoed today, this idea that you could buck the system while still actually receiving a check,
Yeah, and in this Oliver Stone article that you just released here, you had mentioned, referring to Jim Morrison, Jim on the surface was a hippie pinko, but covertly Morrison was serving the CIA clandestine services through the MK Ultra mind control program and promoting LSD to hippie anti-war protesters to stifle them from protesting against the Vietnam War. It was a very useful tool, therefore, against these anti-war protests. I mean, if you're given, excessive amounts and in a party atmosphere, not even an introspective or mind-expanding controlled environment for someone who's qualified with someone who, has more experience to guide someone, nothing like that. These people were just taking this stuff excessively, partying, melting their minds, certainly not focusing on trying to make a large noticeable statement to the Pentagon about the just ridiculously drawn out and damaging war in Vietnam. Now, then you go on to mention here, LSD makes the user look inward and lose interest in anything out of the user's control, including social affairs.
This is an emergency appeal on behalf of UNICEF and USAID. Every 33 hours, a crisis actor dies of hunger. Following the recent Parkland shooting in Florida, at least 5 Jews and some others were killed by an Hispanic, slightly Jewish, white supremacist. We are in urgent need of bagels, empty shell casings, odd shoes, and above all, fake blood. It is critical. Please donate any of the or cash to Bagels for Bagel at unicef.org. Save the children. Give up your guns.
Rose clouds of Holocaust. Rose clouds of flies. Rose clouds of bitter, bitter lies. When the angels of ignorance fall down from your highs. Rose clouds of Holocaust, rose clouds of lies. Rose clouds of twilight truth, rose clouds of night. Rose clouds of harvested love all alive. When the ashes of life fall down from the skies. Rose clouds of Holocaust,
those clouds of light.
So, Rollie, I was just quoting a bit from your article before the break, and set and setting can make all the difference. I'm not discounting that psychedelics can't have some useful potential to expand the mind when used by someone who's prepared for such in a controlled environment with someone who could guide them, this sort of thing. But as I say, that's not what most people were doing with this, excessively available, excessively strong amounts of acid, LSD, that was pretty much everywhere, in the hippie scenes, and supplied by the government, at the top of the chain in the 60s, which yes, had these purposes, of course, and would have those results in such circumstances. I think some of the other connections, though, you mentioned here, Rollie, are very interesting as well. I mean, you of course point out how the Doors got their name from Aldous Huxley's 1954 book, The Doors of Perception, about Huxley's use of LSD. And I was just going to quote this other paragraph you have here. Aldous Huxley's brother was the first director of UNESCO and mentor to George Orwell. No one knew how controlled opposition works quite like Orwell. Morrison was an Emmanuel Goldstein for the Vietnam War effort. False opposition concocted by Big Brother, just as in Orwell's book, 1984. And you go on to mention the MK Ultra kids of Laurel Canyon.
Yeah, Laurel Canyon is actually an interesting neighborhood, and it's kind of like the nerve center of the hippies era, if you rule out Liverpool, of course. In America, it's Laurel Canyon, which is a neighborhood where a lot of military brats grew up in. For example, Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix and Jim Morrison, which all three individuals are part of the 27 Club, which is people that or rock stars, I should say, that died when they were 27 years old. And Laurel Canyon was a place where they made a lot of their music. And David McGowan, who wrote a very wonderful book, Weird Canyon, which was about Laurel Canyon, he stated that these kids, actually did not know how to play their instruments and actually had a band come in and actually record for them. Jim Morrison didn't have any musical talent. He wasn't musically talented, as David McGowan's theory. It's a very interesting theory, how connected, these kids were to the military. Jimi Hendrix was actually in the military but never drafted. Jim Morrison's father was George Morrison, who actually oversaw the Gulf of Tonkin, the perceived attack of a naval ship that actually led us to Vietnam. And Jim Morrison is this Dionysus creature, the god of partying, saying, let's not fight, let's not make war, let's party,
Yeah. That is fascinating, and therefore, that Jim Morrison's father had a key hand in, engineering a false flag to accelerate the Vietnam War.
Matter of fact, they had a committee for what happened in Gulf of Tonkin, and they concluded, on the same day that Jim Morrison died, in a tub in Paris, of heroin overdose, so the investigation for Gulf of Tonkin was over the same day that Jim Morrison's life was over. I always found that fascinating as well. And I always remembered Oliver Stone's handshake that he gave Larry King, that three-knuckle handshake that a master mason gives another mason. And the Doors movie had a lot of occult symbolism in it. And if the character Dave Rothschild's the producer, telling Jim, hey, get down, you want to make a record, wasn't enough for you. They actually had the head of Dionysus, in the film. and there was witchcraft, with his mistress as well. And he was like, "Oh, cool! I like witchcraft. Let's mix our blood together, cut it open, and have a Wiccan, marriage. So that was heavily in the film too. Maybe it was a way to kind of get you, introduced to the Kabbalah a little bit. Like Jewish mysticism.
Yeah. And on a similar note, with your reference to the connections the rock stars can have and to these, cults and groups, organizations. You had mentioned, we were talking about not just Jim Morrison, the hypocrisy with his father's past, but what we were mentioning even in the later generations of rock stars, Marilyn Manson's connection with the Church of Satan and Anton LaVey and what that implies at the same time, right? It doesn't seem like a coincidence, that he was ordained by Anton LaVey and he had the success that he had. I have trouble believing that was a coincidence,
He made sure that he made him a high priest before he died. And now he's probably, right now, the most iconic shock rock figure there is. Is there anybody else more reviled as a shock rock, artist than Marilyn Manson? Lady Gaga hasn't reached those levels of hatred, among the public, and taken the disfranchised, degenerate youth and they degenerate them even more and take them on the road to Highway 666, And, he's actually dated Rose McGowan of the Me Too movement, which I thought was odd because she wasn't talking about the sexual abuse that she had under Marilyn Manson, which I could imagine is a lot, that he collects, like, for example, like severed heads and stuff like that. And, like in our population, for an example, people have made Marilyn Manson kind of an occultic, mythical figure as well. A lot of people believe things that are not true about him, like, for example, that he made his audience sacrifice a dog before he would play on stage. That one is not true. But if you try to tell people, that he was connected to Anton LaVey, and Anton LaVey was actually a Zionist gun runner, which I prove in my article, that a lot of descendants of the Rothschilds and descendants of Sir Basil, who was a major, major gun runner, and the Rothschilds were very connected to gun running. Many people overlook that as well, and they actually joined the Church of Satan, this sort of communion between these two families. Their descendants actually joined the Church of Satan. And, there's a military apparatus inside the Church of Satan. If you look at videos of what Church of Satan is, you'll probably see them being held at a community center, and you got a guy in some sort of satanic clothes, and he's like, whoever has the protege, you left your lights on, okay, hell Satan, let's start our mass, dark mass, But, and Satanism is very connected. It's amazing that a Jewish person actually orthodox Satanism, gave it an orthodoxy. Isn't that amazing, Richard? They gotta make an organized religion out of everything. They gotta organize crime too,
Yeah. Well, you have to control the opposition, So what better way?
And then, of course, you got Michael Aquino, who's Colonel Aquino, actually saw Anton LaVey at a filming of Rosemary Baby in 1968 when he was at the academy to become an officer. And he wanted to join on site, and he kind of gave him a vision of what Satanism is. But, of course, Michael Aquino thought that it was, Satan was very, very real, you know what I mean? Like there's a dark force in the world. And he used his position in the military to collect grimoires. which is just like we mentioned earlier about, Evil Dead with Bruce Campbell, the Necronomicon, inked in blood, written on skin pages, He said that's a matter of national security, and I got to have every single one in my collection so I could go to the Department of Defense library and sit there and read it. He couldn't check it out. He could only sit there and read it. You know what I mean? And
With all...
that's what we got at the Pentagon, And actually, I wrote in my article and discussed on this show, maybe I should put the article, my discussion in one place, but, Jack Parsons designed the Pentagon to be a pentagram, without the arms. And he was actually lost his naval clearance for spying on this newfound nation called Israel and sending a bunch of documents that Howard Hughes had. That's how he lost his naval clearance. The guy who designed or came up with the brainchild for what the Pentagon is. So when you're talking about DOD influences in film and Satanism, it might be a shorter list to say how they don't connect.
Right. Gotcha. Yeah, I'm amazed. Just when you look into it, just how many connections are with a lot of these types, and with everything we've covered tonight, I'm surprised we haven't. But we might as well also hear your thoughts on Charles Manson as well, and his cult. The connections have been speculated on to the government in that whole era.
Yeah, Charles Manson was accused of killing Roman Polanski's wife, Tate. And many people have speculated that he was part of this LSD cult and brain cult thing to be a patsy for all these long streams of murders. This is something that Adam Grow rightly promotes, and it's damn well very interesting in his writing about how he talks about Charlie Manson. I haven't incorporated, any of his work into my material, but I might actually really look into it. We've had callers call in part of the siege movement, and I don't know if they're actually part of the siege movement, but they call in and yell siege, and they talk about Anton LaVey and Charles Manson being their Aryan heroes, and I thought about producing more material about Charles Manson since I've already did Crosses Down, or Horns Up, Crosses Down. Anton LaVey was a Zionist, gun runner. I might actually do a Charles Manson one. But, I got an interesting article that I can't conceptualize right now about Charles Manson, but it doesn't relate to siege in any way at all. They're getting the actress that played, I don't want to do this right now because I'll get it backwards, but
I'm still working on.
Actually, I might start, and if I don't make any sense and I'm deep in the weeds, we'll change the subject. How about that, Richard?
Sounds
I
good.
want to work this problem out real quick. All right, the Suicide Squad is a popular DC movie that came out, and they got the person that played Harvey Quinn, and they have the Moonchild. And, Jack Parsons actually called his group the Suicide Squad, and he tried to produce a Moonchild, right? They're getting the woman to play Tate, who was Roman Polanski's wife, in the Charlie Manson's murders, to play this particular role. And you see how, I'm talking about 3 stories at one time. It's amazing that Hollywood actually picks actors to play a certain role and then play another role to continue another role that they were doing. You know what I mean? Robert Sullivan talks about this a lot in Symbolism Cinema, which is a very good book that I haven't finished, but from what I read, that's one of his theories about his book.
Okay, so the people who are contracting these actors for these roles, they kind of see a long-term goal, a certain influence on the public with an actor's portrayal in a number of roles. Something that crosses the barrier of any single film. Long-term sort of influence that they're focusing on the public with that actor.
Yep, and we were just talking about Roman Polanski, which is this actor that's above reproach in the Hollywood media right now. What if I told you that a particular actor wrote about the Holocaust called the Pianist, where they got this actor named Brony, I think it was Adrian Brody, who actually broke up with his girlfriend, in the middle of the film, just so he could get that same sort of trauma and like crying about breaking up his girlfriend as he was the Holocaust, just so he could get into character. So Roman Polanski actually made the movie The Pianist, right? And then in the 1960s, he talks about producing a child from an orgy. How do you explain that to a neutral Martian observer? You know what I mean? Like, why wouldn't the public, raise an antenna with that at all? You know what I mean? Something that Anton LaVey could have been a part of that film. Many people say that he was a devil eyes that, essentially gave conception to Rosemary's Baby in the middle of the film, or even the hands or the consultant. He really liked that film, and I think that he was involved with that, making that film too. And I don't think that's an urban myth that he was a devil eyes in that film. But yeah, like I have a hard time, explaining that to, my relatives, that these people that are seen as sensitive artists, they make such perverted trash, and that they could watch the movie Jaws, which was made by Spielberg, and he scared you to even ever go in the waters because you're going to get eaten by a mechanical shark. But Schindler's List was a very, very sensitive film, a very realistic film, about how World War II went down, and it was a one-way suffering of the Jews, and nobody else suffered during that particular war. That's absolutely egregious.
Well, it also tried to portray the Holocaust as something that actually happened, and anyone who's done any serious research would see, that is so full of holes that it's not even something that you could, claim in the way they try to refer to this as a genocide. I mean, there were people who were dying of disease, and there were some individuals who were killed because of various types of government infiltration or various key positions and roles upon things that these people had. But that was the extent of it. I mean, of course, this was mostly projection, as far as atrocities that the Russians did to the Germans after the war. And yeah, I mean, so it's certainly, not accurate at all, as for that matter, and certainly quite the opposite. But no, we have a bit of time left, and not, all that much, but I did want to mention something I forgot. At the top of the show, I should mention another film that had a strong impact on me was Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. I never really explored too much of the earlier ones, but I thought that had I mean, when I look back on it, I can sort of analyze it a little more critically and see some of the propaganda I'm sure I could even spot in that. But at the same time, it was a very interesting look at coming out of the 80s, what we could see possibly in a post-apocalyptic future. And a lot of these dystopian films, they seem to desensitize us to put up with something closer and closer to that. As elites could concentrate, all of the luxury for to themselves more and more. What's your take on the whole dystopian film era? I don't think they're made as well anymore as a film like that these days. They're very cheap and just have very. But the agendas all along are questionable. Don't you agree?
I do remember Road Warrior, which is a movie before Mad Max Beyond the Thunderdome, where they had this pink-haired motorcycle gangster that had on his back motorcycle this queer, blondish-haired man that actually got the boomerang indented in his head by the feral kid, unnamed, promoting the gay agenda, because they were ravaging and just killing the women and keeping, stealing their resources. Why would they kill the women? They produce babies, but they were cool with this gay relationship, inside that movie. Richard, I'm itching to go back to Schindler's List. Is that okay?
Sure, please.
I got one more point about Schindler's List. Ben Kingsley, excuse me. He was in Schindler's List. He played Gandhi in 1982. He played Itzhak Hawk Stern, which helped Oscar Schindler make his general list. Did you know in Iron Man 3 he was the Mandarin as well?
All right. No, I did not.
So they got a guy from Schindler's List to play the Mandarin, which is this character that Tony Stark perceives to be this head of this criminal organization that might even be religiously fanatical in nature. They never really got to the religious beliefs behind it. And he gets into his apartment and he has a ton of girls around him. And then he tells them that he's a paid actor to be the face of a corporation that's actually a criminal empire. But if you want to go back to the dystopian films, I could go back there as well too.
Oh yeah, I am also curious. Yeah, to hear your take on them in general and any specifics you want to elaborate on.
We talked about earlier where man is just getting back to his primordial nature, which is a theme. Getting sucked into the jungle in these Vietnam films. Even in Mad Max, it wasn't really getting sucked into the jungle. It's just like scavenging for resources. You don't have these luxuries.
Society is breaking down. You don't have the luxury of a police force, for example,
Yeah, and Mad Max was the police in the original film that he was, Mad Max film, which is no way. It doesn't even seem like it's the same film, That went to shit. Now he has a rifle that's a 2-shooter that only has one bullet in it, and there's no law. He doesn't care about anybody. He just cares about his next meal and finding water. And it really gets back to, man in his primal state where he's just worried about his next meal, finding shelter. They're not even worried about producing families. The village that, they made a society that was gated, they were interested in making a society, but the Marauders were not. They just wanted to go in and pillage and rape, and that's definitely a sign that we as a society need to have unsecured borders, because what if we're surrounded by Marauders eventually as well, and they make this idea that North Korea could shoot a pulsate, international ballistic missile and totally disrupt and shut down the grid, and it takes several years to go back to it, and this idea that, that could be us, we could be the road warriors again, and there's Marauders everywhere. And we were talking about Fast and Furious, that gangs are usually formed around races, as well. And I could definitely see that the gangs, the Crips, the Bloods, the MS-13, they would already have their hierarchy in place. Will we do the same?
Yeah, absolutely. Because it is what happens when societies start breaking down more. Increasing tribal conditions lead to more, racial binds, right? It's just natural. White
liberals will be hunted down like white meat if the grid goes down. We're all like fish in a tank. How they're nice you got these bigger tanks. Ripley's Believe It or Not was really popular in South Carolina. They got sharks, they got like turtles, and they got all that. And I always thought as a kid looking at these tanks, like if the man stopped throwing in fish food for these guys, they would eat each other. That's like how our society is. As soon as you get rid of that comfort, people start acting like animals, and we get sucked back to the wild. And Gordon Watson, who studies shamans and the MK Ultra and Crowleyite, understood that as well. And part of the hippie movement was, we don't need these facilities. That's what the CIA was trying to promote to function and run. We could go back to a third world country. Frank Wisner, who ran the Mockingbird program, actually said, talked about intelligence between third world countries and America, and he concluded that the Americans are willfully stupid, where the people from third world countries are just ignorant, you know what I mean? So like this idea that we're basically at that level already of intelligence is kind of how the elite sort of see us, and they're always looking for new ways to keep us in control, and they might actually pull the plug on the TV one day.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, energy is, water and energy seems to be like the theme in these sort of films. It'll all, boil down to, and of course, technology would regress quite a bit. As you say, survival at a more primal level will consume most people's daily lives once again.
I always kind of thought this demand for Dick Cheney and Bush, back in the 2000s, to go ahead and get as much resources as we can so that we could already use it. It wasn't about America needs 25% of the resources in the world, so we got to invade it. It's this idea of completely just draining all the resources so we could have this sort of Mars atmosphere so that we would go back to the States. So there would be this call to go back to barbarism, that we're a tribal society again.
Yeah, and we have all these refugees pouring into all these countries. Along with benefits, they're all given a smartphone instantly, and watch, nothing else will ever be invented as society degrades. But everyone will have a smartphone.
He has another gun. All day wrong, he makes his way. She tries to shield it on. Right or wrong, she makes it way. Breathe into rain. The inside mark like a timing gun into rain. The inside mark like a timing gun. Point another gun.
Mainstream media only ever gives us one side of World War II. They don't want us to know the real history of what happened over 70 years ago, seeing through the eyes of the German victims. The horror of the terror bombing, the mass rape of millions of women and children, the torture and murder of civilians, the death camps for surrendered soldiers, the ethnic cleansing of whole countries, and the planned extermination of the entirety of the German people. After watching Hellstorm, you'll never see the good war and the good guys in the same light ever again. Watch for free and get DVDs at hellstormdocumentary.com.
A godfall drag on me into the chasm gaping we. Mirrors multi-reflecting this between sponge-stained sheet and odorous whim. Have eye affliction within, assist me to walk away in sin. Where's the string that Theseus laid? Find me out this labyrinth plane. I think I'm wrong.